in Indochina began in December 1946. And after 4 years stuck in the quagmire of Vietnam, the French were forced to take stock. They sent for reinforcements. From now on, half of their troops would come from Morocco, Senegal, and even Algeria. As in 1939, the colonies had to come to the rescue of the colonizing power. And as in Madagascar 3 years before, they were forced to fight other colonized people.
Notre père va être volontaire et partir dans l'armée française pour partir en Indochine. Lui, il admettait cette idée que oui, volontaire, j'étais volontaire. J'ai fait son accent, hein. Bon, je ne peux pas m'empêcher, parce que je l'entends, à son âme, mais je l'entends. Et comme il disait, mon fils, c'est la propagande des Français. Ils étaient quand même forts pour nous faire passer cette idée-là qu'on allait bien gagner de notre vie et que c'était un bon, en gros, on dirait aujourd'hui, un bon plan pour les pauvres extrêmes qu'ils ont été.
Young French volunteers did not necessarily commit themselves out of patriotism.
Je mentis en disant que je prétendais défendre la perle de l'empire colonial français et tous les clichés habituels. Non, on partait courir l'aventure. L'aventure avec un A majuscule, c'est la seule chose qui m'intéressait.
Despite military inferiority, North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh stuck to a simple but effective plan: guerrilla warfare. He compared his army to a tiger facing an elephant. The cat needed to strike fast and hard before disappearing back into the undergrowth.
كان باتوا في الليل كيخرج واحد ولا جوج الناس ناعسة، جوج الناس كيجيو واحد ناعس كاو عليه يذبحوه. كتقول من ديابل هذوك.
L'ennemi était partout, c'est une guérilla. On peut vous souffler une flèche empoisonnée à la sarbacane, là, sur le dos qui était foudroyant.
To defeat the French, the forces of the North Vietnamese coalition, the Viet Minh, had conventional weapons at their disposal, as well as newspapers. Propaganda was everywhere.
La nuit, on commence à écrire des tracts pour éveiller, c'est très naïf, pour éveiller la conscience des soldats français. On se met à composer des poèmes. Je fais un poème que je me rappelle toujours, après presque un demi-siècle, qui s'appelle « Noël sans réveillon, Noël sans carillon, c'est la faute des colons. » Voilà. Et j'ai réussi à tirer deux soldats. Ils ont quitté le rang des Français et ils ont regagné notre rang. C'est ma première victoire.
In the north of the country, the situation became more complicated. In China, the communists had seized power, so now Ho Chi Minh had the support of a much bigger and more powerful neighbor. In response, the United States decided to support France. Indochina was no longer a simple colonial conflict. It was a new front in the Cold War. In October 1950, the fighting on the Chinese border hit new levels of intensity. The French army lost 5,000 soldiers. But above all, they lost their sense of their own invincibility. The Viet Minh took control of the north of Vietnam, where Chinese aid now arrived unhindered. Caught by the throat, the French government dispatched its most prestigious general, Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, hero of the liberation of France in World War II. They called him King Jean, and in January 1951, he swung into action, and the French army inflicted successive bitter defeats on the North Vietnamese. In the thick jungle, the French used every means at their disposal, and that included a highly flammable petrol jelly, napalm.
Vous entrez le matin dans un village où il y a des volailles, des poules, des poulets, des volailles, des cochons, etc. Et le soir, après un coup de napalm, vous entrez dans une terre lunaire.
Bởi vì nó có cái là người dân Việt Nam lúc đó chỉ thấy rằng nếu bị thua một lần này nữa đó thì chỉ có chết thôi, chỉ nô lệ là nô lệ thôi. Đánh giặc mà hy sinh nó là coi nó là đồng chí nào hy sinh thì phải chịu thôi, chứ còn bao giờ cũng phải có hy sinh.
But back in France, most people appeared indifferent to events in Indochina. Only a third of the population supported continuing the war in order to preserve the empire. The French communists campaigned fiercely against what they called, quote, a dirty imperialist war. Their slogan was, not a man, not a penny for the war in Indochina. At the ports, their cameras secretly filmed what no one wanted to see: the coffins of growing numbers of French soldiers stacking up on the quayside. The MP Pierre Mendès France was one of the few to foresee the tragedy that lay ahead. He called for the start of negotiations. But the government remained blindly stubborn. The empire must not be sold off, and communism must be prevented from spreading. By the spring of 1951, the number of troops sent to Vietnam had grown to more than 140,000. The war continued regardless. France's problems in Indochina were mirrored in North Africa. In Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, people demanded more and more freedom, while the colonizers living there looked the other way.
Mes grands-parents maternels ne se rendent pas compte de la réalité de l'Algérie coloniale, du dénouement extrême dans lequel vivent depuis des générations la majorité musulmane, la majorité arabe et berbère. Je pense qu'ils ne veulent pas savoir, mais encore une fois, ma grand-mère m'a souvent répété qu'ils étaient très ignares par rapport à ça. Le fait que les masses algériennes puissent aspirer à un État indépendant est quelque chose qui ne fait pas partie de leur cadre de pensée.
While the local colonizers averted their eyes, people's misery fed nationalism. In Tunisia, the pro-independence leader Habib Bourguiba had continued his fight. Since the 1930s, the young lawyer had come a long way. He'd been arrested several times, but continued to demand his country's independence. His public speaking electrified large crowds, but the colonial authorities here were no more disposed to grant Tunisia autonomy than anywhere else in the empire. And France then made a bad mistake. Rather than negotiate with Bourguiba, in January 1952, they arrested him and imprisoned him on the island of La Galite. Far from calming tensions, this simply exacerbated them. Anti-French attacks increased. The Tunisian reaction was swift. The situation quickly became explosive, and the army and police intervened. There were many deaths, and these enraged the Arab world. The protests quickly spread to Morocco.
La Grande Mosquée et tous les points clés de Casablanca ont été occupés par les forces du maintien de l'ordre. Des perquisitions ont été effectuées dans les centrales syndicales où l'on a saisi de nombreux documents établissant la collusion de tous les éléments extrémistes. Les meneurs vont être jugés. Déjà, de nombreux leaders responsables des émeutes ont été placés en résidence forcée dans le sud marocain.
Mon père a été arrêté, il a fait 2 ans de prison. L'ensemble des dirigeants ont été regroupés dans des centres. J'avais 5 ans, je rappelle qu'avec ma mère, qui avait le droit de lui rendre visite 2 fois par an, qu'il fallait 2 jours de voyage pour arriver là où il était, qui se retrouvait au fin fond du sud marocain, dans une maison, au milieu de nulle part.
The French authorities wanted all the independence movement leaders gone. After Bourguiba's exile, they put his Moroccan counterparts under house arrest and then removed the Sultan of Morocco, the future king Mohammed V. They replaced him with a weak old man with no political legitimacy. But by attacking the Sultan, France created a martyr. The initial Moroccan riots turned into a major armed struggle.
The crowded marketplace of Casablanca is a scene of horror as a bomb explodes in a dense crowd at the height of the business day. 19 were killed instantly.
As in Tunisia, the French were unable to deal with the crisis other than by force. At the United Nations in New York, France was immediately put in the dock. 4 years earlier, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman had affirmed France's commitment to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. This time, he ignored them and said the UN should not meddle in an internal French matter.
Il est du devoir de l'Assemblée que dans sa sagesse, elle sache se maintenir dans les limites de sa mission et qu'elle ne prenne pas la responsabilité de compromettre une tâche qu'avec foi et fierté la France a entreprise en Afrique du Nord.
The French colonial issue had entered the public arena, and a new front had opened up over North Africa. In early 1954, France froze. The Catholic priest Abbé Pierre launched a major appeal for the homeless. Torn between a domestic housing crisis and imperial conflict abroad, the French government needed to act decisively. After 8 years embroiled in Indochine, it sent in a new commander, General Henri Navarre, with a plan to strike a major blow against the Viet Minh. His forces installed themselves in the Dien Bien Phu Basin, a strategic position surrounded by mountains. His objective? To force the enemy out of the jungle and engage in direct combat. The French still considered themselves invincible, but they would be proved wrong. The French army was unaware that in the silence of the hills, the North Vietnamese coalition forces, the Viet Minh, were preparing a major assault. They carried tens of thousands of tons of equipment and artillery to the top of the hills overlooking the French camp. While trucks carried the majority of the heavy weapons, two wheels also came in useful.
Và tất cả ai có xe đạp thì cái xe đạp mà phần lớn là cái xe đạp của Pháp.
Pour transporter les 360 kilos de riz, le plus apprécié, ce sont les Peugeot. C'est les meilleurs, les plus aimés. Et si les pneus éclatent, la route est très sinueuse, on n'a pas de pont pour réparer, alors on prend les vêtements et on enroule autour de la roue et on passe.
After 3 months of preparation, on the 13th of March 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu began. Hidden deep in caves, the Viet Minh artillery was invisible and the shelling relentlessly powerful. Despite being protected, even the medical teams felt the full force of this barrage.
Ça a été tellement violent que personne ne sortait des abris. On était dans les couloirs en se disant demain matin, Il y aura certainement une avalanche de blessés qui va arriver à l'antenne et il faudra faire face. Et là, c'était dramatique parce qu'on ne pouvait pas tous les opérer en même temps.
Several French battalions were soon put out of action. There was no hiding place. The French were trapped. Stuck deep in the basin, the wounded could not be evacuated. On the 7th of May 1954, after 55 days of fierce resistance, the last ranks gave way.
Et c'était poignant. J'ai attendu le petit matin, puis je suis retourné prévenir mes blessés que c'était fini. Et ça a été pour eux beaucoup de tristesse, mais aussi un peu de soulagement de penser qu'il n'y aurait plus de blessés, plus de nouveaux morts.
Đều cờ trắng ra hàng. Có những anh là không có cờ trắng thì là lấy áo sơ mi trắng ra cùng với mùi xoa các thứ dơ lên thế này để làm cờ hàng để ra hàng. Thì đó là một cái hình tượng của cái ngày chiến thắng như thế mà tôi chứng kiến ngay tại chỗ.
C'est un sentiment de délivrance. On est fiers. Nous avons participé à ce grand mouvement. Tout le monde se jetait dans ces rues-là en éclatant de joie, en s'embrassant. Tout ça, c'est la victoire de Dien Bien Phu.
Thù ghét thì nói đối với người Pháp thì không có gì thù ghét. Nhưng nói về cái chế độ, cái thống trị của người Pháp, mình không đồng ý cái đó thôi.
On the French side, the disaster resulted in more than 3,000 dead and 5,000 wounded. The Viet Minh captured nearly 11,000 troops. France had suffered a humiliating defeat, the worst since the dark days of 1940.
Le seul regret que j'ai là-bas, c'est d'avoir perdu un de mes meilleurs camarades. Mon meilleur ami, qui est un Français. Je l'ai perdu en Indochine. Ça m'a fait beaucoup mal.
On a pris de Mandris qu'on y a laissé pas mal de plumes. Et tout ça, ça n'a servi à rien. C'est quand même désespérant puis humiliant aussi, parce qu'on dit qu'est-ce qu'on est venu foutre là?
The military crisis soon became a political one. Pierre Mendès France, who had been advocating negotiations since 1950, became Prime Minister. On the 20th of July 1954 in Geneva, he succeeded in negotiating a ceasefire and pulled France out of the Indo-Chinese quagmire. Vietnam was divided into two separate states. The north returned to the Viet Minh, while the south became a republic placed under American protection. Cambodia and Laos saw their sovereignty recognized. It was the end of French Indochina. Like domino pieces falling one after the other, the loss of Indochina had immediate consequences. It forced France to give back to India trading posts it had administered for nearly 3 centuries in Pondicherry, Mahé, Karikal, and Yanao. In October 1954, France withdrew from Asia to the apparent indifference of most French people. France had lost nearly 80,000 soldiers. Thousands remained to be evacuated. Fighters from the four corners of the empire, prisoners, the wounded, damaged for life. French citizens who'd settled in Indochina, plus thousands of Indo-Chinese auxiliaries who had chosen to defend the French, were repatriated to France, often in difficult conditions. They'd lost everything. Reports of the defeat echoed across the whole empire.
Ce matin à 10 h, on était dans la cour et brusquement la nouvelle se répand et on s'est regardé. Et pendant que toutes nos amies étaient effondrées, nous, des yeux, on riait. Si les Indochinois sont arrivés à battre l'armée française, et pourquoi pas nous?
In part 2, with France's destiny turned upside down, the authorities still strive to preserve their colonial power at all costs. More conflict approaches, but the fall of the French Empire is now only a matter of time.